So my name's Edward Farrell. I run a cybersecurity practice called Mercury Tower. I wanted to take a bit of a different tack on our talk and go through what I've called a critical analysis of the Australian cybersecurity industry. The talk is probably a little bit different to some of the really awesome technical content we've had over the last day and a bit, and what you're expecting a little bit later this afternoon. But I think it was, for me, important to have a bit of a reorientation into a bit of the how and why, what we do, but also understand what's influencing our place in society and the world. So whilst we've got some really awesome technical content, if it doesn't have that high level appreciation of, okay, it's got to actually have a practical purpose, then it can really be unsustainable for us as individuals. But this is me, a photo with functioning arms and no facial hair. Just before anyone asks, I decided to get injured in Canberra courtesy of getting swooped by magpies, so everything is certainly trying to kill us in this country. Outside of that, I've been running my own practice now for 12 years, a correction for 7 years, and doing pen testing well and truly prior to that. So as I said, my focus on this talk has really come in from that pen testing mindset of we try and understand and learn things based on our own interactions, our own analysis. And so as I've found myself moving more into the, I guess, fluffy management side of the place, I've had to start adapting how I think through and break down things to work out the systems that represent our industry. I'm concerned fundamentally that how we rationalise our role and our place in the market is probably not reflective of what is actually needed. And for us as cybersecurity professionals, we're not setting ourselves up for success in terms of creating meaningful work for us, but also ensuring that the industry is sustainable instead of simply driving growth for the sake of it. I think I also have a concern in some of our approaches mentally of why we're getting into things and why we do a lot of our work in security is actually causing a bit of harm as well, insofar that if we are pushing ourselves purely from our own entertainment or our own illusions of fighting good versus evil, that too is actually creating a lot of harm, and we are simply assuming that we're getting hacked by everything and, oh my God, the world's going to end. So when I talk about the industry, I think it's important that I just have a bit of a definition of scope here. In this case, I'm looking at the cybersecurity services market more generally, and that's just because that's my area. Most of my work is in pen testing and assurance, but I do find myself rolling incident response, especially when someone's beaten us to the mark in pen testing, and also observing a lot of the behaviours and actions by things such as managed security service providers, all the way through to governance and risk specialists. So my focus here has really been heavily on the services space. I think when we start looking at product, I'll just briefly comment that we are seeing, probably more so from my observations on a service side and working with customers, we are seeing purely engineering and development focuses that are encumbering, and the actual operational and service liability behind those for a lot of my customers is now starting to encumber and slow down and prevent a lot of organisations from working effectively, but we are seeing people try and work around that. But I think for me, the big thing I keep seeing is we are seeing a lot of reinvention of the wheel instead of let's actually come up with some original ideas and some original thinking. So what's driven this topic? I think if we come back to the economics of how and why we exist, I think that's a really good grounding. One, for starters, it is ones and zeros as opposed to simply ideological pushes. And so for me, a lot of this was very much a question of our economics. So if we look at our industry, the actual IT services industry in Australia nowadays sits at about $40 billion. Which, if you look at most companies, their cybersecurity expenditure as a subset of the IT budget is usually around 12%. So our services industry is about a $4.8 billion market. So if we were to work on a hypothetical of, say, at $4.8 billion of income, if we just said, well, let's roughly say 75% of that's going to salaries, just as a rough figure. More often than not, it's actually substantially less. Work across the average salary, we work out that there's probably about 30,000 jobs that exist within the actual professional services industry. Any given day in LinkedIn on Australia, there's anywhere from 44,000 up to about 50 to 55,000 people that identify as having some role in cyber. But that's also including folks like product developers. I did a really weird, interesting statistic. If you ever want to anger recruiters, highlight that there's one recruiter for every 4.88 cybersecurity professionals online, and then try and work out the math of a 20% commission on everyone's salary for those people to work and the required process for that. So I think there's a peculiarity and a bit of a disparity in terms of how many people we actually have in this space versus how big the actual market is versus how much that market's expanding. And the supply side can only really be influenced by demand, which I think can also be harder to quantify as well. We've got conflicting views on the financial impacts versus the second and third order effects of our actual demand as well. They say that apparently cybercrime costs $3.95 billion in 2019, and funnily enough, that figure's decreasing, but also that's the indirect cost. The actual direct cost is substantially less. So we've now kind of got a bit of a disparity here. We're spending a lot of money to deal with a problem that may not necessarily be as big as we need to. However, we've also got now, on top of this, a big push of, hey, we've got a growth industry. We've got to keep growing cybersecurity. We've got to keep recruiting more professionals. And I think for me, this kind of hit me as to, well, where is this all heading? And so I think we need to come back to some economic necessities in our decisions around what we call cybersecurity and how we keep talking about, well, we've got to grow, we've got to have more people, and we've got to have more professionals. I think this is actually probably the big takeaway I would have from my analysis, which is if we are a growth industry, it means we didn't fix the problem in the first place. And if we are growing, it means that we are encumbering. If we are encumbering, it means that our customers are going to get very angry and very exhausted with us very quickly because we are trying to fight good and evil. As I said, direct cost to business realistically is probably about $1.9 billion. However, we then, as I said before, second and third order effects behind this. The two big failures that have happened in the Australian IT industry with Distribute IT and a financial services firm here in Sydney wasn't actually that they lost a ton of money, it was that they lost confidence with their people. So for me, the actual requirement may end up being more around trust and confidence than necessarily a direct financial thing. And so I think this is something that we haven't fully qualified in our economic analysis of the market. And so that kind of leads into a cost of the actual problem versus putting up versus paying for someone. So I think one of the comments I had leading into a lot of my analysis in this space was someone made a peculiar comment, which was that for their experience with cybersecurity consulting was that they got a report that told them what they already knew, and they had to pay $50,000 for it. And so we're now also starting to see some headwinds around people are spending a lot of money without necessarily deriving a lot of value. This was just another peculiarity I had as well in terms of our market and our economics, was what are some of our inputs? And I talked about this before in terms of our demand side economics. This was curiosity I came across probably about 6 or 8 weeks. In fact, before I submitted this talk, this was one of the influencing factors, which was that there is a statistical measurement to work out, okay, how many more people do we need in the cybersecurity industry? And the statistics that are gathered around vacancies in the ICT sector is focused on pretty much, let's scrape recruitment sites and identify unique values. Now, the problem here is, if you have a look on the right-hand side, is just a simple screenshot from Google. These were 4 separate jobs on seek.com that were in fact the same job. However, there was enough variation in each of these job descriptions that was getting presented by a recruitment company that it's actually quite likely these were identified as separate jobs. So suddenly
our notional vacancy in our sector is actually 4 times higher than what it really is. Just perhaps based on this ad, I'd say there's even more cases where this happens in greater detail. This now turns into, okay, so the fundamental input for us to say that we have a lot of vacancies and we don't have enough people to employ in this space is actually kind of getting informed by a statistic that at its fundamental standpoint, the inputs for it are just not there. And so we now create an inflated demand for something that really doesn't exist. But it's also important to look at some of the incentive models we have in this country as well. My personal observations and experience has been in Australia, there is this wonderful illusion that you're going to make more money either as an Instagram influencer or as a real estate agent. Now, the problem is that makes sense, certainly at the higher end of that echelon, but as you start progressing through a lot of those careers, the reality is 80 to 90% of those places actually have a lower standpoint in terms of making income and generating revenue versus, say, some of our technology degrees, which have a higher threshold to actually break into, but once you get there, generally speaking, you're okay. And so the point I have here is that we have very much this view of the world where there are 1 or 2 people that are doing fantastic, and we have that as our illusion for success. Whereas, well, if you break things through slowly, if you go through your paces and do a reliable engineering degree over time, there's a little bit more stability, slightly better income, and you may not get to that point where you're in that pinnacle top 1%, but it's at least a stable environment. I think this kind of also started influencing some of my thoughts around why a lot of people are suddenly becoming cybersecurity experts without doing some of the work that many of you here are doing, which is, hey, I'm going to attend a 2-day conference, absolutely blow my mind away with wonderful technical talks. So beyond that economic analysis, I started in 2019 going through organisational and structural analysis so that as I started growing my own company, trying to establish what our competitive landscape looked like and what were some models of success around business. In 2019, in January, I decided to map out what does the pen testing environment look like in Australia. And for me, it became evident that there were a lot of organisations that were purely just there with, say, a heavy administrative staff, maybe 1 or 2 people doing delivery. And so it became evident that the sort of older model of, well, if we have a lot of consultants who just focus on that consulting effort, generally speaking, we're going to create a better product, we're going to create a more simpler process, but as well, we're going to be in a place where we can lower costs and also lower the mental burden that often comes with an over-encumbering organisation where you have 5 managers telling 1 person what to do. So that tooth to tail ratio was evidently going in one extreme when we started doing this analysis. However, it was also obvious that there were a lot of businesses out there. There was a diseconomy of scale, and we should have seen this coming in about 2019, was the opportunity for consolidation and acquisition, which saw the evolution of companies such as Tesserent, CyberCX, and half a dozen others. So I tried redoing this analysis, and the problem is the data set I originally used had changed substantially, and so my ability to collect and map out this environment was much harder. However, I was still able to identify that same theme, although now exacerbated in half of the firms I'd been doing analysis on back in 2019, which is you now have a much wider management space versus there aren't just enough technical people to justify all of these administrative roles. So this top-heavy focus means that there's now a big push for a cheaper labour cost and hoping that the sudden influx of this cheap labour doesn't then see a drop in daily rates in the commercial sector. We're also seeing very much as well across the market a big drive on what I call process-driven approaches to cybersecurity. But the problem is our industry has uncertainty. It does not take 0.4 hours to pen test an IP address. It does not take 1 hour to build a widget. And so this uncertainty and, quite frankly, this chaos is inconsistent with these traditional models we have when it comes to approaching business. We also think, this is my other general observation, I think we've started to take an approach to management that is also quite disingenuous. So the idea that you now have managers that have not necessarily come from technically grounded environments, and as a result, I think we also start seeing places where there's assumptions that get made by management that are inconsistent with those on-the-ground realities. And so I think there has, in previous years, been a focus on you spend your 20s and 30s building up that technical expertise so that when you move into that period of your 40s, your 50s, your 60s, you can actually have that expertise and that knowledge of how things have taken place in the past to actually help you provide direction and mentorship for those working for you. So I refer to this as the Edwardian construct. I'm not naming it after myself. It's actually more a cultural reference to what happened after the Industrial Revolution, which is you have very much this management-focused culture that looks at, okay, so much effort results in an output. This makes sense when you don't have consistently changing variables and we're not operating in chaotic environments where we are dealing with acts of malice. The cold, hard reality behind this is that a lot of our expertise now actually exists in very much what I would say on the ground level at the bottom. And yet our structures are yet to adapt to this reality, specifically in Australia. And I think if you look at the Australian environment, we are still a colonial country. We still have colonial bureaucracy. That means that we focus quite heavily on, well, we'll do lots of meetings, we'll do a risk management approach, as opposed to, well, let's actually get things done out of actual necessity. And this, I think, then translates into, well, because you've got an MBA or some management background, you can just turn up, call yourself a cybersecurity company and deliver lots of TED Talks. So we then see very much a pyramid scheme start to evolve economically around this. So we start to see no barriers to entry at these higher levels. We then see an economic incentive of, okay, I'm going to go into the C level or into a middle tier role because, hey, I've got some existing experience elsewhere. I may just need to do a quick readaptation, but then our capacity to have our technologists and our people on the ground with this expertise I was talking about catch up. There's a 6 to 12 month consolidation period behind that. We've got to build those people up. However, the illusionary economic incentive isn't for them to go into those roles. It's for the smart people to actually go a little bit higher up because that's the environment that we've created. So unfortunately for me, this becomes a very encumbering approach. It also means that we will constantly go through the cycle of, oh, we don't have enough people, and then anyone we train and we rush through doesn't translate into effective operations. And in a place where we have the cyclical environment, where our environment's constantly changing, this presents a significant risk. So I probably thought about it a little bit when I was starting to draft this topic. And I started off with talking about, well, is this simply a rehash of the dot-com bubble? The problem we had with the dot-com bubble was that IT companies that were spinning up in Silicon Valley weren't actually meeting market needs. They were engineering systems for the sake of engineering without actually meeting an explicit demand to the market. I don't think we're at that point. However, I think our capacity to meet explicit needs is quite limited. And I think there's things that inform that. A lot of that's also around what I call our intermediary organisations that exist. So some examples that we've had here in the last 12 months in my business is for us to actually engage on several projects. We have to work through an intermediary who will take a commission of 10 to 20%. In one case, one of these commissions was going to be about 40% of the contract's total value for about 15 minutes of phone calls by that intermediary, as well as, of course, filling out checklists and questionnaires that talked about how they adhere to the Modern Slavery Act, how they adhere to the UN's conventions to counter slavery. The problem we have with that, though, is we now have an unnecessary barrier to engage with certain contracts, and we also remove a barrier to entry. So we assume that because someone's filled out a ton of paperwork and is adhering to some of these governance requirements, they must be experts, and also probably because they have cybersecurity in their name. But then there's the actual need to qualify your cybersecurity professionals off the back of that. And one of the things that I'm seeing a lot of is, well, we'll just hire a 19-year-old with no experience, pay them an absolutely dirt cheap wage, and then hopefully we have a positive outcome off the back of that. Now, aspects that have led to this and probably inform some of the decision makers in this space is what I call quantifiable metrics in compliance. So the problem we have is largely driven around, well, we'll do risk rating tables. The problem is that we do not have enough quantifiable data to inform those risk rating tables, so that actually becomes quite dangerous. And then on top of that, we have an approach and a belief as a result of that Edwardian construct of, well, we'll also focus on time and materials. Just a question to put out there. If you could solve a problem in 15 minutes instead of taking 3 months, what would your role as an engineer be? Like, show of hands, who would actually want to solve the problem in 15 minutes? Yeah, most of us. The reality is, though, there's no economic incentive for us to solve that problem in 15 minutes. If we're charging hourly or daily rates, we're going to drag this out as long as possible. We're going to have tons of meetings, and so, yeah, that's exactly how we fix. Apparently, that's how we do technology. Let's just drag this out. And as long as we focus on daily rates, and as long as we focus on billables, that's exactly what's going to happen. Clausewitz has a very interesting, Karl von Clausewitz, the military theorist, has a very interesting theory on people that don't move fast enough. Same with Charles Darwin as well. Another paper as well that was also influencing some of my thoughts was Huawei versus Nortel versus Lucent, or Alcatel-Lucent, the communications companies, between 1999 and 2008, where there was actually a shift back towards, okay, let's just focus on quarterly profits. In the case of Nortel and Lucent, this saw both companies lose substantial market share, whereas ongoing investment in engineering and people with Huawei has actually seen them rise substantially. The other thing, though, is we also still very much have influencing this, what I call a people, education and culture problem. So I have some good news. None of you had to turn up today. You just had to present a loud enough influence on LinkedIn. Feel free to take a photo of this. The actual reading of this particular court case, WT versus Victoria Police, is very interesting. Some of you may actually know that individual. I will not give his name out just because said individual likes suing people. However, this person was, for a very extended period of time, according to a lot of media companies, was the authority of cybersecurity person on here in Australia. They were charging a lot of money to investigate cybercrime. However, I had hoped this person had gone away. However, a phone call I had with a referral about 4 months ago was there was a domestic violence victim this individual had charged $50,000 to. The services he delivered was, here is a spreadsheet cataloguing all of your personal devices, and I've started making abusive phone calls to the perpetrator saying that they're under investigation. We have not called out this individual. We are not doing anything to create barriers to that person's entry into our environment, and quite frankly, there isn't really anything we can do because we haven't built out the environment. What we have built out, I've found in my personal experience, is the last 20 years have seen us talk about ethical hacking and good versus evil and frame things in a very Western view of how we think through cybersecurity. And for me, that was actually a big lead into very much the Edward Snowden effect. So, yeah, for me, this idea of we have ethical codes that we can impose on anyone because we're ethical cybersecurity professionals starts to become problematic. That's not to say we don't mean to do good, but I think we have a very bad habit, or we are starting to espouse these habits of as I said, good versus evil. Let's evangelise the world and enforce our own subjective bias because we are the saviours of the world. I think this then starts to lead to very much this idea of someone becoming an expertise without having gone through their own professional development and their own training. And so you saw before, we've got this vacuum and this lack of supply of people. Does this mean that we start creating people who are just here to dress up and let everyone know they're cybersecurity professionals? Or are we going to be able to create meaningful professionals, even though, let's come back to supply and demand, quick, we need to get people through, so we'll just punch them through a very quick training course and hope for the best. And this kind of comes into this idea of the training environment. So I still don't believe we have a standardised training curriculum yet. Training starts to become too expensive, so let's do shortcuts, let's create really simple certification paths that involve answering multiple choice questions, and suddenly we'll give you a Cert 4 as a cybersecurity expert. Now, the problem we have with that is what we also call the Dunning-Kruger effect. That is to say that someone with a qualification, skill, or prior experience is suddenly infallible and therefore can be trusted on everything. I said before, the environment and the space we are operating in is dealing with uncertainty, it's dealing with chaos. Layering on someone that hasn't actually gone through an extensive training activity that sees them build out the appreciation process that leads them to make qualified decisions, as opposed to, well, you can just run it, you can run Eternal Blue as an exploit and you're a cybersecurity professional. That becomes quite dangerous, and we saw this with the MCSE about 20 years ago. For those of you unaware, this was how Microsoft measured your expertise in being able to install and administer Microsoft Microsoft product. In my experience, when I was working in a network operations centre some 17, 18 years ago, we had a lot of folks getting pumped through these certification programs that could not troubleshoot particularly easily. And unfortunately, we've now translated that same model to cybersecurity, where troubleshooting things such as tools failing or this is unexpected just doesn't get trained, because training that sort of expertise does not scale, whereas pumping people through multiple choice questions does. And so what we are starting to see as well is an oversupply of education, which then leads to a degradation of quality in order to make sure that you can keep getting people through. So I guess with that in mind, we're not there yet, but what happens when we start having this oversupply of cybersecurity professionals? It does lead to us having a reduction in salary. I think one of the points that that we have seen within the IT environment over the last 20 or 30 years is, well, we'll just offshore things, or we'll just bring in a fresh grad because that's going to make sense. The problem we have with this, however, is that over time, if there's not enough food, if there's not enough jobs coming through for all these professionals, does that create hostility? So think of, say, a lake where there's not enough fish and all the birds still need to eat. Everyone starts to get a little bit aggressive and a little bit hostile. In an environment where we are training things such as offensive and defensive security, that starts to become problematic. It means that our defensive security professionals will find everyone doing everything wrong and will start creating more work. It means that our offensive security professionals, especially those that can't find work, become disenfranchised and start to behave in a way that probably isn't healthy for us. And we saw this with the fall of the Russian economy after the collapse of the Soviet Union, which of course led to a lot of the carding gangs and then subsequently a lot of the ransomware gangs that we see in the world. The root cause of these people isn't because they're living in their parents' basement wearing hoodies and Guy Fawkes masks. A lot of it is because if you look at the situation, certainly in Eastern Europe and in Russia, you have an environment where they've trained up a lot of really awesome individuals, but for them to actually generate any meaningful income that allows them to support their families, they have to go off and do criminal things. And so I think this is probably another thing to call out as well as we start going through this cycle of, we've got to create lots and lots of cybersecurity professionals, Do we start going down an environment where we create an army of insider threats, or where we create more problems than we do create solutions? And I think this kind of is a good little lead into my thoughts on actually how do we fix this. And I'll be honest, I don't really have all the answers. I know what we don't need, and that's really coming back to boot course. That's coming back to some of the common themes I just highlighted there. We don't need boot courses that don't factor in consolidated training and professional development, hands-on. We don't need any more shortcuts to get into an industry so that you can tell everyone that you work in cybersecurity. We also don't need these barriers to entry that actually prevent awesome professionals coming through. Same way that we don't need to create shortcuts for people as well. And we also don't need yet another company where someone was doing management consulting and they're now an expert. So what are some high-level thoughts? I think if we have a look at history, there's some interesting lessons that I think we can derive from the healthcare industry and the aviation industry over the last couple of 100 years. If we look at the medical sector in 1870, it was possible to become a doctor with 12 weeks of training, and you didn't actually need to turn up to course. Does that sound a bit familiar to our space? Who actually would trust that doctor? Maybe to get a couple of free scripts, because also late 19th century, cocaine was a little bit easier to get and a little bit more socially acceptable. But my point here is we saw in the United States, certainly after the Civil War and all the way through to the 1920s, greater regulation and maturity in terms of who is qualified as a healthcare professional, but also what's our original research that says that that's based on empirical data that says a particular path or an avenue of approach in healthcare makes sense for being able to achieve an outcome for a patient, as opposed to, we'll put leeches on you and hope for the best. The same can also be said with the aviation industry in the 1920s, where there was still a lot of hit and miss, and we're just going to keep making mistakes until these aircraft take off. That has actually formed a lot of the quantitative data that informs things such as airworthiness requirements, which is where a lot of people are thinking around cybersecurity and cyberworthiness requirements. Is over time there will be a really decent body of knowledge based on a lot of the work we're doing here over the next 20 years to create the quantitative data that informs things like an aircraft shouldn't be flying for more than 100 hours without a maintenance check. And I'll also say with that, cyber insurance actuarists don't have the data to provide qualified opinions on insurance, so personal opinion, I think we need to stop selling cyber insurance as well. But I guess another curiosity here is, well, across both industries, we also have a risk of going down the wrong path. And we see this in the United States with their healthcare system, where, once again, commercial incentives has seen them create tons of surgeons and certainly not enough GPs, and that has degraded their capacity to provide just general health advice. So I think there's opportunities to learn through other economic environments and other systems for us to adapt. Someone's made these mistakes at some point in the last 5,000 years of recorded human history, so there's got to be something we can learn from all of these. One of the other ones that I am also a big advocate of, and certainly it's something that I try and shape in my own business, in my own line of work, is how do you actually create a business structure that's sustainable over decades? And medieval craft guilds was, I think, one of the big ones that I always liked looking at. So the focus behind your craft guilds was there was an emphasis on quality and a dependence on your reputation to actually get things done. There was also greater regulation around wages and prices as well. I don't think we'll ever make a return to that. But there was also a designated path of hands-on training to actually create your professional workforce. So you'd have your apprenticeship, you'd then have a journeyman who'd just be your person who could do a day-to-day job, and then your master craftsmen who knew their trade back to front. They also had social and religious aspects to their organisations as well. Sounds kind of similar to some of the weekend conferences, including this one that we end up going to. But they also didn't have a disproportionate support staff. They were able to function themselves without needing a massive supply chain following them constantly. And so I think one of the curiosities I have here is how can we start shaping education and our training environment and our professional environment such that we have a focus on this quality and a focus on this reputation piece. These are still things that I'm constantly thinking through and building out. I do try and write up as much as I can in terms of thoughts and observations over the years. But folks, look, thanks so much for attending. Thanks for having me, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.
Well, guys, we do have time for 1 or 2 questions. So if you do have a question for Edward, raise your hand and we will pass you the mic.
Okay.
Oh, one at the
one
back.
down there and one just up the back there.
Awesome.
If I can just ask like this, can you hear me?
Yep.
How do you see the government inputs into the industry as a whole? So, the cyber workforce and sovereign cyber stuff, is it going to be like an outlier, or long term do you see it adding value to the industry, or is it just going to create more public servants?
Good question. I would say both. I think we are starting to see government bureaucracy start to expand, which when I start talking about things such as creating a better regulatory environment, that can help, and in fact that's what most bureaucrats focus on, but I also can see the risk of a bureaucrat seeking just to build an empire that doesn't necessarily translate into an outcome for us as taxpayers. So I think it's a double-edged sword in terms of creating the bureaucracy. If we have a look at Red Spice, I think that's going to start doing some of the unique research and insights that we need that just commercially we can't do ourselves because it's not financially viable, and yet it has a better outcome for society. So I think if it's done right, great, but if it's, let's just throw money and we'll also create a cybersecurity dance troupe and bureaucracy, and we'll have 1 or 2 techies, and yeah, that's where that risk can actually play out. So I think that is probably where my big concerns lie in that space, but it can do good if it's done right. And the Red Spice piece that is coming out, we are starting to see some good out of that in terms of research, but I'm also concerned that there could very well be too much of a focus on offensive capability there as opposed to the defensive space, which is relevant to us.
Thank you very much.
We have time for 1 more question.
I think we had one down here before. Yep. Yeah, just belt it out.
Well, thank you. Very controversial opinions on certain topics that I think takes a lot of guts to speak with in public, in particular about some of the political aspects that you touched on. I think, just as a summary overall, do you appear to be hopeful about the process of maturity in this market, and considering the market corrections and the economic corrections that are taking place? Do you think we are on the right path? Thank you.
Yep. So, yeah, thank you for the comment there before on speaking out. I think it's something that we need to do. We shouldn't just go cyber as good children is our future. But your comment about will there be corrective actions with the market? I hope so. I think my big fear is that those corrective actions actually introduce more problems, which is kind of why I talked about the Russian piece before of, they created these massive spying apparatuses that then translated into some of the problems that they had during the 1990s that have then translated into some of the transnational crime issues we now have. I think that a slow market evolution and correction will be good. My big fear is if we have a massive expansion of, we need 1,000 new techies, let's just build it, and then rush it through, and then 12 months later it's ineffective. That I think is probably going to be our big risk, where if we move too fast, we're going to crash really fast as well. So I think you will start to see market corrections and adaptations and evolutions over the next 3 to 5 years. But I think my big fear is if there's companies that are moving too fast, we have every risk that it's going to backfire. Thank you.
Awesome. Well, thank you for presenting your analysis to us. Hack Sydney has a gift for you. Thank you for coming.
Cheers. Thank you.